Eliza Carter pressed her back against the cold wooden wall and listened to her husband count her failures out loud. Her cooking, her silence, her inability to give him a son. And she did not cry. She had stopped crying 2 years ago. She simply stood there, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor, and told herself what she told herself every morning. Survive today. Just today. She did not know that on the other side of that wall, a stranger had just tied his horse to her fence post and was already watching. If this story moved you, I want you to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to Raven Creek, Montana, the summer of 1886, and to a woman who had been disappearing, one silent day at a time. Eliza Carter had learned to read the sound of boots on a porch. She could tell from the weight of a footstep whether the evening would be quiet or whether she would spend the night pressing a cold cloth against her cheekbone and practicing excuses in the dark. Heavy, slow steps meant Walter had been drinking. Quick, purposeful steps meant he was angry about something before he even walked through the door. The middle sound, that careful, measured pace, was the worst, because it meant he hadn't decided yet, and the decision was always going to be made at her expense. She heard the boots now. Slow tonight. Very slow. She moved the iron skillet to the back of the stove and folded her hands in front of her apron and prepared her face. That was the word she used inside her own mind. Prepared. Because that was what it was. A preparation. The way a person prepares before stepping out into a storm, they cannot stop, but can try to survive. The door opened. Walter Hayes was a broad man, wide through the shoulders, with a jaw that had started going soft at the edges and eyes the color of creek mud after rain. He wasn't ugly. Eliza had thought he was handsome once. She had thought a lot of things once that no longer had any home inside her chest. He looked at the table. He looked at her. He looked at the table again. "Biscuits," he said. "Yes," she said. "I told you last week I was tired of biscuits." She kept her voice level. She had spent 3 years perfecting level. "I can make cornbread instead. It won't take long. It's already on the table." "I know, I'm sorry, I can—" "Sit down, Eliza." She sat down. Walter pulled out his chair across from her with a sound like a small violence, wood scraping hard against the floor, and he lowered himself into it and stared at her the way he sometimes did, like she was a problem he hadn't yet solved, like she was an equation that kept coming out wrong. "Caleb Walker was in town today," he said. She kept her face still. "Was he?" "He was talking to Henderson at the feed store. You know what they were talking about?" "I couldn't say. Fence repair." Walter picked up his fork and stabbed a piece of salt pork with more force than necessary. Now why would a mountain rancher need to talk to the feed store owner about fence repair? Eliza said nothing. "You wouldn't know anything about that." "No." He chewed slowly. He watched her. The silence between them was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that had shape and weight and edges, the kind that pressed down on her sternum until it was difficult to breathe without it showing on her face. "Good," Walter said finally. "Because if I found out my wife was giving a stranger reason to come around this property, that would be a conversation I wouldn't enjoy having." Eliza looked at her plate. "I understand." She did not eat much that evening. She rarely did anymore. She had been 24 years old when she married Walter Hayes, and at the time it had seemed like a reasonable thing to do. Her father had just passed. The ranch, 60 acres of good Montana land that James Carter had spent 20 years building from nothing, had been left entirely to her, and everyone in Raven Creek had opinions about a young woman alone on 60 acres with no brothers, no husband, no protection. The word protection had meant something different to her then. She had believed, genuinely, and with the whole of her heart, that protection meant safety. That a man's care was a shelter you stepped inside gratefully, like a barn in a hailstorm. She had not yet learned what she knew now, that some shelters were built with only one door, and that door locked from the outside. Walter had been charming. He had also been strategic, though she hadn't recognized the strategy at the time. He had seen the 60 acres and the woman who didn't yet know how vulnerable she was. And he had arrived with compliments and patience and that particular warmth that men like Walter reserved for the courtship period, for the weeks before the door swings shut and the real self steps out from behind the performance. She had signed over the deed to the land within a year of their wedding. He had explained it to her patiently, the way he explained most things to her, with a voice that implied she was slow, but he was too kind to say so directly. He said it made more sense legally. He said it was cleaner. He said it was what married people did. And didn't she trust him? She had trusted him. That trust was the single biggest mistake of her life, and she had been paying for it every day since. The ranch hands who had worked for her father had left within the first year. Walter replaced them with his own people, men who answered to him and who looked through Eliza like she was made of glass. She tried to manage the books the way her father had taught her. James Carter had believed in his daughter's mind and had given her a real education in numbers, supply chains, cattle pricing, land valuation. But Walter had taken the ledgers away from her and told her that numbers weren't a woman's concern. He had taken her books, her father's books, the ones with James Carter's handwriting in the margins, the notes and calculations and little observations that made Eliza feel like he was still in the room when she read them. Walter had boxed them up and moved them to the locked room at the back of the house, and when she asked for them back, he had looked at her with that particular expression, not quite anger, not quite contempt, something that lived precisely between the two, and told her she was being sentimental. Sentiment doesn't run a ranch, he'd said. She had stopped asking. She had stopped asking about a great many things over the course of 3 years. It was easier. The asking always led to the expression, and the expression sometimes led to worse things than expressions. And she had learned that the distance between a bad evening and a very bad evening was often just the number of times she pushed back. So she stopped pushing. She cooked. She cleaned. She kept the house the way he liked it. She wore the dresses he preferred and pinned her hair the way he approved of and sat quietly at church every Sunday while he greeted the congregation with his broad, solid handshake and his reliable smile. And everyone in Raven Creek thought Walter Hayes was a good man, and Eliza stood at his side and said nothing to contradict them. She had almost convinced herself that this was enough, that surviving was the same as living, that a woman who had nowhere else to go had no business wanting more than what she had. Then, Caleb Walker's horse stopped at her fence post on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, and everything Eliza Carter had told herself about what she deserved began to come apart at the seams. She had been working in the garden when she heard the hooves. Not unusual. The road ran near the south edge of the property, and riders passed through regularly. But these hooves slowed and stopped. She straightened up, one hand braced on her lower back from bending, and she looked through the fence rails and saw a man sitting easy in the saddle on a dark bay horse, looking not at her, but at the south fence line with an expression of calm professional assessment. I was lean in the way that comes from real work, rather than deprivation, with dark hair pushed back under a battered hat and a face that the weather had been doing interesting things to for several decades. He wore a dark brown vest over a rolled-sleeve shirt, and he sat the horse the way men who have spent most of their lives on horseback sight, loose and certain, like the animal beneath them was less a separate creature and more an extension of their own balance. He hadn't looked at her yet. I was still looking at the fence. 3 rails need replacing on this southern stretch, he said, to no one in particular, or possibly to the fence itself. And the post there, the third one from the corner, it's heeled over about 15 degrees. Another season, and it'll bring the whole section down. Eliza blinked. I know, she said. Now he looked at her. He had dark eyes, the kind that registered information quickly and filed it away without making a production of the process. He touched the brim of his hat. Ma'am. Who are you? Caleb Walker. I run a spread up on the North Ridge, couple miles above the creek. He looked back at the fence. You mind if I ask who handles maintenance on this property? The question was straightforward and practical, and carried no particular weight, and yet it landed in Eliza's chest with a strange heaviness, because the answer to that question was nobody. Walter delegated ranch work to men who did as little as possible and were paid accordingly, and the south fence had been declining for 2 seasons, because nobody had reported it, and she had stopped reporting things because her reports were not considered her business. "It's being seen to," she said. Caleb Walker looked at the fence again and then back at her, and his expression said, with great politeness, that he did not believe her. "I've got spare rails in my wagon," he said. "Came down the mountain this morning with a load for Henderson. Got more than he needed. It'd take me less than an hour." "I can't accept." "I'm not offering charity, ma'am. I'm offering to get rid of extra lumber before I have to haul it back up the mountain." He said it simply, without any particular emphasis, and somehow the simplicity of it made it harder to argue with. "I've also got nothing better to do for the next hour. Horse needs a rest anyway." Eliza looked at the fence. She looked at the third post from the corner, heeled 15 degrees exactly as he'd said. She thought about Walter's voice the previous week, telling her to stay out of ranch business. She thought about the expression. Then she thought about the fence coming down in another season, and the cattle getting out, and the cost of rounding them up again, and the conversation she would have with Walter about why she hadn't reported it sooner. "1 hour," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He climbed down from the horse with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times, tied the animal to the fence post, carefully, not to the one that was healed, and walked around to his wagon without another word. Eliza stood in the garden and watched him work for a while, uncertain what to do with herself. She was not accustomed to someone doing something useful near her without expecting anything from her in return. The sensation was unfamiliar in a way that made her vaguely suspicious, because her experience had been that people always expected something, and the question was only what and when. But Caleb Walker did not look at her with expectation. He looked at the fence posts and notches and his hands, and he worked with a quiet concentration that she found herself watching, not because he was a man, but because it had been a very long time since she had watched someone do a thing simply because it needed to be done. After 20 minutes, she brought him water. He thanked her the way you thank someone for water, sincerely but without excess, and drank it and handed the cup back and said, "Your soil's good here, better than up the ridge." "My father chose it carefully," she said. Something shifted slightly in his face. Not much, just a small settling, the kind that happens when a person registers something worth registering. "He was a rancher?" "He was. James Carter." She paused. "He built this place." Caleb nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're actually thinking about what you've said rather than just waiting to speak. "Good bones," he said. "You can tell when a property was built by someone who knew what they were doing." She hadn't heard someone say something kind about her father's work in so long that she didn't know what to do with it. She just nodded and went back to her garden and listened to the sound of a man replacing the fence rails her father had planted 20 years ago. And something small and tight in the center of her chest loosened, just slightly, for the first time in longer than she could honestly say. He finished in 50 minutes. He checked the third post, reset it properly, and tamped the earth back around the base. Then he walked over to where she was still in the garden, dusting his hands against his trousers, and he said, "That'll hold. But you'll want to look at the north corner before winter. There's some rot starting at the base of the end post." "Thank you," she said, "for doing it. Like I said, just moving lumber." He touched the brim of his hat again. "You take care of yourself, ma'am." He climbed back up on the horse and rode off up the road toward town, and Eliza watched him go, and she thought, that is what a person looks like when they aren't trying to get anything. She had forgotten what that looked like. Walter came home 2 hours later, and she did not mention the fence or the stranger or the extra rails, and dinner passed quietly. And she lay in bed that night and listened to her husband breathe and thought about what Caleb Walker had said about her father's property. Good bones. It was such a small thing to say. It meant almost nothing. And yet she replayed it until she fell asleep, because it was the first time in 3 years that someone had looked at something connected to her and called it good. 2 days later, she was checking the garden when she heard hooves again. She told herself she was not looking for them. She heard them anyway. Caleb Walker pulled his horse up at the fence and looked at the gate, and then looked at her with the same practical, unassuming expression he'd worn 2 days ago, like he had simply arrived at a task that needed doing and was assessing where to begin. "I was going to check the north corner post," he said. You don't have to do that. I know. He looked at the corner post. I want to. She opened the gate. He checked the post and determined that yes, the ROT was worse than he'd initially assessed from the road, and that it would need to be replaced before the first frost or the whole north corner would collapse. He told her this plainly, without drama, and then asked her if she wanted him to replace it now or come back with the right materials next week. She said next week, because she needed time to think about whether she was making a mistake. All right, he said. Mr. Walker, he paused. Why are you doing this? The question came out more directly than she'd intended, but she couldn't take it back, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. She watched his face and waited. He considered it for a moment, genuinely considered it, which was not something people in her life generally did before answering. Because it needs doing, he said. And you're managing this place alone, which isn't fair. And because your father built something worth maintaining. He looked at her steadily. And because I've got good eyes, and what I see when I look at this property isn't a woman who doesn't know what she's doing. It's a woman who hasn't been allowed to. The silence after those words was different from the kind of silence she shared with Walter. This one didn't press down on her. It just sat there between them, neutral and clear. Next week then, she said finally. Yes, ma'am. He came back the following Tuesday, with replacement posts and the right tools. And he worked through the morning, and Eliza brought coffee this time, and they talked. Not about anything urgent or important. About cattle pricing and the harshness of the Montana winter, and whether the summer rains were going to hold. But it was real conversation, the kind where both people were actually present, and Eliza realized with a small shock that she had not had a real conversation in so long. She had almost stopped believing they were something that happened to people like her. Walter came home that evening and asked about her day, and she told him she had been in the garden, which was true. She simply didn't mention the rest. The omission sat in her stomach like a stone, but she told herself it wasn't deception. It was survival, and those were different things. She had learned to tell them apart. What she didn't tell herself, not yet, was what she was starting to feel about that difference. Because somewhere in the space between Caleb Walker fixing her fence posts and looking at her the way you look at a person who matters and telling her that her father had built something good, a door had opened inside her that had been locked for 3 years. And she was beginning to understand, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had been the one holding the key all along. Eliza Carter pressed her hands into the garden soil and felt it, cool and dark and real, between her fingers, and she thought about her father's handwriting in the margins of the ledgers she hadn't touched in 3 years, and she made a decision that felt very small in the moment and very large in her bones. She was going to remember who she was before she became someone's wife. She was going to remember it one day at a time, and she was going to be very, very careful. Because Walter Hayes did not let go of things he considered his. And he had always considered Eliza Carter his. But that, she was beginning to understand, was the thing about chains. Sometimes you don't notice they're loose until someone walks past, and the rattle reminds you that loose means something. She pressed her hands deeper into the soil. Her father's soil. Good bones, Caleb Walker had said. Good bones. She was going to remember that too. Eliza did not sleep well that week. She lay in the dark beside Walter and listened to the silence of the house and thought about the look on Caleb Walker's face when he'd said a woman who hasn't been allowed to. The steadiness of it, the lack of performance, the way he had stated it like a simple observable fact rather than a compliment designed to get something from her. She had turned those words over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what lives underneath, checking them for angles, for hidden purposes, for the catch she had learned to always expect. She couldn't find one. That bothered her more than the words themselves. She had become a woman who could not receive a genuine thing without suspecting it. She understood, distantly, that this was what 3 years with Walter had done to her, had filed down her instincts until they were all pointed inward, all turning against her, all asking, what does he want, and what will it cost, instead of, is this real, and do I deserve it? She didn't know how to stop doing it. She only knew that when she tried to apply that same suspicion to Caleb Walker, it kept sliding off him like water off oilskin. because the man had fixed her fence posts and replaced a rotting corner post and charged her exactly nothing and asked for exactly nothing. And even her well-practiced distrust couldn't build a case out of that. She got up before dawn on Wednesday and made breakfast before Walter woke, and while the coffee was heating, she opened the drawer beside the stove, the one she kept her household accounts in, the small notebook where she tracked what she spent at the market and what came in from the egg sales and what she quietly set aside each month in a tin she kept behind the flour sack. It wasn't much, it was never much, but it was hers, and Walter didn't know about it, and she had been adding to it in small, careful amounts for 2 years without being entirely sure why, only knowing that a woman with no money of her own was a woman with no choices, and she had already lost enough choices. She looked at the numbers in the notebook and thought about what Caleb had said about the North Corner Post and the approaching winter. She thought about her father's ledgers, locked in the back room. She thought about all the things she used to know how to do. Walter came downstairs at 6:30, ate his breakfast without much conversation, and left for town. He had business at the land office. He always seemed to have business at the land office, and wouldn't be back until evening. Eliza cleaned the kitchen and then stood in the center of it for a long moment and made a decision. She went to the back room. The lock was a simple thing, the kind her father had installed when he used the room for storage and wanted to keep the hands from getting into his tools. Walter had changed the key, but not the lock, and Eliza had spent 3 months the previous year carefully experimenting until she found that a particular hairpin, bent just so, would turn the mechanism if you had patience and steady hands. She had both. The room smelled like dust and old paper, and something underneath that she recognized immediately and couldn't name out loud without it breaking something inside her. The specific smell of her father, of his pipe tobacco and leather, and the particular soap he had used, still clinging faintly to the things he had touched. She found the ledgers on the second shelf. She took only the most recent one, the one from the last year before he died, and relocked the door and sat at the kitchen table in the early morning quiet and opened it. Her father's handwriting was exactly as she remembered, small and precise and confident, with the occasional notation in the margins where he had been working something out. Check spring pricing on yearlings. Talk to Morrison at the bank. Eliza says the north pasture soil needs. She stopped at that one. Eliza says. He had written her name in the margin of his ranch ledger, like her opinion was something worth recording, like what she said mattered to the running of the place. She put her hand flat on the page and stayed very still for a moment. Then she started reading. She read for 2 hours. She had not lost it. That was the thing she had been afraid of. That 3 years of disuse had eroded the part of her mind that understood these numbers, that she had let Walter convince her into actual incompetence, and not just performed incompetence. But the numbers made sense to her. The patterns were clear. The pricing cycles, the seasonal adjustments, the way her father had structured his cattle sales to avoid the worst of the summer market fluctuations. She understood all of it, and more than that, she could see where the current ranch books, the ones Walter kept, were going wrong. She hadn't seen the current books. Walter didn't let her see the current books. But she knew the property, and she knew the land, and from what she could observe about how the ranch was being run, the condition of the fences, the number of cattle compared to 3 years ago, the quality of the hay they were putting up, she could make educated guesses. The guesses were not encouraging. She put the ledger back before Walter came home and said nothing over dinner, and listened to him talk about his meeting at the land office with the attentive, appropriate expression she had perfected, and inside, she was thinking about numbers. Caleb Walker came back the following Tuesday as promised. He came with the replacement post and the tools, and also, unexpectedly, with a practical question. "I've got a problem," he said, setting down the post near the corner. "My ranch foreman left last month. Family situation, had to go back east. I've been doing the books myself and I'm making a mess of it." He looked at her directly. "Henderson in town says you were your father's bookkeeper before you married." Eliza went very still. "Henderson says a lot of things," she said carefully. "He said it respectfully." Caleb's voice was even. "Said James Carter used to brag on your head for numbers. Said you could look at a season's worth of cattle sales and find the inefficiency in under an hour." She didn't know what to do with the fact that her father had said that about her. that he had said it in public, in the feed store, to people who had remembered it years after his death. She felt it move through her like something warm and also painful. "That was a long time ago," she said. "Numbers don't change," Caleb said. "The way a person understands them doesn't either, in my experience." He picked up the post and moved it to the corner. "I'm not asking for charity. I'd pay you. Standard bookkeeping wage, same as I'd pay anyone in town." The word pay hit her differently than she expected. Not the amount, the concept. The idea of money she had earned, for work she had done, for a skill she possessed. Not the careful skimming from the household accounts, but actual wages, actual compensation, actual acknowledgement that what she knew was worth something. Walter wouldn't allow it, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it, and the honesty of it sat between them in the morning air. Caleb drove the post into the ground and said, without looking up, "Does he have to know right away?" It was a dangerous question. It was also, she realized, a real one. Not an invitation to deception exactly, but an acknowledgement that there were ways to do things that didn't require asking permission first, and that sometimes the asking was the problem rather than the thing being asked about. What would the work involve? She asked. Monthly cattle sales records, supply purchase tracking, payroll for 3 hands, quarterly reconciliation with the bank and billings. He looked up at her. 4 hours a week, maybe 5. You could do it here if you wanted. I'd bring the books to you. She thought about the tin behind the flour sack. She thought about her father's handwriting. Eliza says, "Let me think about it," she said. "Take all the time you need, ma'am." She thought about it for 4 days, which was 3 days longer than she actually needed. She had made up her mind within the first hour, but she spent the other 95 hours checking her reasoning from every angle she could think of, looking for the place where the decision fell apart, looking for the catch. She came back to the same place every time. The catch wasn't in Caleb Walker's offer. The catch was in her own life. The catch was that she had skills she hadn't used in 3 years, and a husband who had convinced her those skills didn't belong to her, and a property that was slowly failing because of decisions she wasn't allowed to question, and a tin behind a flour sack that she had been filling out of something that felt a lot like very quiet desperation. She sent word to the Ridge on Friday. She would take the work. The first time Caleb brought the ranch books to her kitchen table, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. The specific, clear-headed pleasure of a problem that could actually be solved. She opened the ledger and looked at the columns, and within 10 minutes she had found 3 pricing errors and a supply duplication that was costing him $40 a quarter. She looked up at him across the table. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. Like he'd expected this, and was satisfied to see he'd been right. "You've been overpaying on your winter feed order," she said. "The supplier in Billings is charging you the per-unit price on lots over 50 without applying the bulk discount. It should be applied automatically above 40 units. How much has that cost me? In the last 3 quarters? Approximately $120. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll write to Billings on Monday. I can draft the letter if you'd like." Something shifted in his expression then. A small thing, easy to miss. "I'd appreciate that," he said quietly. She wrote the letter that afternoon, after he'd left, and she did it at the kitchen table with her father's good pen that she'd kept hidden in the bottom of her sewing basket, and she wrote it with the careful precision her father had taught her, laying out the billing discrepancy with evidence and the correction she expected and the timeline for resolution. And when she was done, she sat back and looked at it and thought, "I know how to do this. I have always known how to do this." The knowledge sat in her chest like something she'd been missing without knowing she was missing it. Walter came home that evening and she told him she'd spent the afternoon sewing, which she had also done briefly before the letter. The stone in her stomach was heavier this time. Not because she felt guilty. She had stopped examining her guilt too closely, because she had found that guilt was often just the bruise left by someone else's control, but because she was beginning to understand that she was constructing a life inside her life, a parallel set of choices and actions and earnings that existed in the space Walter didn't think to look. and the construction of that parallel life meant she was already further along than she had admitted to herself. She was not just surviving anymore. She was planning. The realization should have frightened her more than it did. 3 weeks later, Walter found out. Not through any mistake she made. She had been careful to a degree that would have exhausted her if she hadn't found the work itself so sustaining. But through the particular cruelty of small towns, where information moved faster than wind and privacy was a commodity nobody could afford for long. Margaret Tilley had seen Caleb Walker leave Eliza's property on a Thursday morning and had mentioned it to her sister, who had mentioned it to her husband, who had mentioned it at the barber shop. And by the time the story reached Walter, it had been expanded and colored by every person it had passed through, until it bore only a partial resemblance to anything that had actually happened. Walter came home that night with a specific quality of silence that she had learned to recognize, the held, deliberate kind, the kind he used when he wanted her to feel it before he spoke, when the anticipation was itself meant to be a punishment. She was setting the table when he came in and didn't speak, and she continued setting the table with steady hands, and the silence stretched. "I heard something interesting today," he said finally. She set down the last fork. "Did you? About Caleb Walker visiting this property." He moved to the center of the room, and she tracked him in her peripheral vision without turning. "On more than one occasion. He repaired the south fence," she said, "and the north corner post. The fence was failing. You can see it from the road. I didn't ask you to have the fence repaired. It needed to be done." The words came out quieter than she'd intended them, but steadier than she had any right to expect from herself. And she felt the steadiness of them like something new in her mouth, the strange sensation of a muscle being used after a long disuse. Walter's voice didn't rise. It never rose when he was this particular kind of angry. It went flat instead, and flat was worse. "You made decisions about this property without consulting me." "About a fence, Walter. About a stranger coming onto my property." The word "my" landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, and she watched the rings spread outward from it, and thought about her father's deed, and the papers she had signed, and the locked room, and the ledgers, and all of it, all at once. The whole accumulated weight of 3 years of my and mine, and belongs to me. "The fence needed fixing," she said. "You will ask me before you invite strangers onto this property." He offered. I accepted. "It cost you nothing." "Eliza." His voice was very quiet. "I will not say this twice. You do not make decisions about this property. You do not invite men to this property. You do not conduct yourself in a way that gives this town cause to talk about my wife. Do you understand me?" She looked at him for a moment. Really looked at him. The way she hadn't allowed herself to for a long time, because looking directly at Walter had always felt dangerous, like meeting the eyes of something that might strike if it felt observed. "I understand you," she said. She did not say, yes. He noticed. She saw him notice. Something moved across his face, quick and cold and assessing. "Good," he said. "Don't make me have this conversation again." He sat down to dinner, and she served it, and they ate without speaking, and afterward she washed the dishes, and he sat on the porch, and she stood at the kitchen window and thought, he is going to go to Caleb Walker. He is going to try to end this before it becomes something he can't control. She was right. The next morning, Walter rode into town and came back 2 hours later with a face like hammered iron, and that evening he told her, in the same flat, controlled voice, that he had spoken to Caleb Walker and made clear that his wife was not available for any kind of employment arrangement, and that Walker had been informed that further visits to this property would not be welcomed. "I see," she said. "I hope you do." She did. What she saw was this. Walter had gone to a man he'd never met, a man who had done nothing wrong and had spoken to him on her behalf, about her, without asking her a single question or acknowledging for one moment that she was a person with agency in the matter. He had represented her to another man the way you represent property, by establishing ownership and asserting a boundary and not consulting the property at all. She also saw something else. She saw that he was afraid. She had never seen Walter afraid before, and she might have missed it if she hadn't been looking for exactly this. The way his jaw was a fraction too tight. The way he'd come back from that conversation, Not satisfied, but unsettled. The way his eyes moved to her face a half-second too quickly when she didn't react the way he expected. He was afraid because someone had looked at her and seen something worth recognizing. I was afraid because she had done something, even something as small as accepting a fence repair, without asking him first. He was afraid because control is only certain when the person being controlled doesn't know their own value. She dried the dinner plates with a careful, unhurried motion. She thought, he made a mistake going to Caleb Walker. Because Caleb Walker was not the kind of man who would receive that conversation and simply leave it there. She was right about that too. The following Thursday, 8 days after Walter's visit to the Ridge, a folded note arrived at the house while Walter was in town. It came with the egg delivery from the Morrison farm, tucked between the crate slats, passed along by someone who hadn't asked questions and wouldn't be asked to answer any. She read it at the kitchen table with the door latched. Mrs. Hayes. The bookkeeping arrangement stands, if you want it. The work doesn't require your husband's permission. It requires yours. If you want to continue, I'll leave the books with Morrison on Thursdays. You can return them the same way. Nobody needs to know anything they don't need to know. The wage will be paid in cash through the same arrangement. This is your decision to make. C.W. She read it twice. Then she held it over the stove and let it burn. Not because she was afraid of it, but because a piece of paper was evidence, and she had learned from her father's ledgers what evidence meant and how to protect it. She did not send a reply. She didn't need to. She left the egg crate with a clean cloth folded inside it when she sent it back to Morrison on Friday. A signal they had not discussed and did not need to, because some things between people who understand each other don't require negotiation. They simply require a choice. She had made hers. The next 4 weeks were among the most complicated of her life. She was running 2 parallel existences. The visible one, the one Walter saw, the quiet and appropriate wife who kept his house and made his meals and attended Sunday services at his side, and the one that happened in the hours he spent in town, at the kitchen table with the ledgers Caleb left with Morrison, doing work that made her feel like herself again, in a way that was so sharp it sometimes hurt. She found a second discrepancy in the supply accounts, a duplicate payment to a fencing contractor that Caleb's former foreman had apparently let slide. She documented it meticulously, laid out the recovery process, and included it in the returned ledger with a note that was half an inch of clear, specific language and nothing else. Caleb's responding note, 3 days later, said only, "Thank you. Your father taught you well." She held that note over the stove too. She held it a little longer first. The town was talking. She knew it the way you know the weather. Not from direct information, but from the particular quality of the silences when she walked into the general store, the way conversations adjusted when she approached, the looks that lasted a half-second too long. Raven Creek had decided it had an opinion about Eliza Carter and Caleb Walker, and the opinion was not charitable, because Raven Creek was a town that loved a story with a villain, and was always willing to choose one that made the least powerful person responsible for the most uncomfortable situation. Women came to her with concern threaded through their voices like wire through a fence. The kind of concern that was actually a warning. The kind that said, "We see you, and we want you to know that we're watching, and that you should be careful not to embarrass us by being the kind of woman who embarrasses us." Margaret Tilley told her, with great seriousness, that appearances mattered, and that a woman's reputation was her most valuable possession. Dorothy Crane stopped her after church to say she hoped Eliza wasn't causing Walter unnecessary worry. Eliza thanked them and smiled and said the appropriate things and went home and sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon quiet and felt the anger move through her. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, clarifying kind. The kind that burns slow and lights things up rather than burning them down. The kind that made her see everything more clearly than she had in a very long time. She wasn't causing Walter unnecessary worry. She was doing 4 hours of skilled bookkeeping work per week and being paid fairly for it. That was the whole of it. And yet the town had decided that was a scandal, because the town had also decided, without being asked, without any particular evidence beyond the fact of it, that a married woman doing independent work for an unmarried man could only mean one thing, And that one thing was the most interesting explanation, and therefore the one they preferred. She had wanted to be angry at the town. She found she couldn't sustain it. She'd known these people her whole life, had watched them operate this way about other women, other situations. The same comfortable machinery of judgment that kept everyone in their assigned places. Being angry at Raven Creek for being Raven Creek was like being angry at the winter for being cold. What she could do was refuse to let it move her. And then Walter started listening to the town, not in the way he'd confronted her about the fence. That had been Walter asserting control over a situation he considered manageable. This was different. He started watching her the way a man watches something he thinks might escape. He started asking, in his casual, offhand way, the way that was never actually casual, where she had been when he came home, who she had spoken to at the market, whether she had seen anyone on the road. She answered him honestly, as much as the parallel life allowed. One evening in mid-August he told her, very quietly, that he had heard she had been seen speaking to Tom Morrison at the farm gate for an extended period the previous week. "I was collecting eggs," she said. "For 20 minutes? I couldn't say exactly how long, Eliza." He set down his coffee cup with a precision that was itself a kind of threat. The deliberate, controlled placement of an object by a man who was controlling the impulse to throw it. "I am your husband. I am telling you what I expect. I expect you to conduct yourself in a manner that doesn't give this town reason to question my household. That is a very simple thing I am asking you." "I know what you're asking," she said. "Then I trust we understand each other." She looked at him. She looked at the coffee cup set down in its precise and threatening way. She looked at the hands that set it there, and she thought about how much of her life had been organized around the placement of those hands. "We do," she said. But she was thinking about something else. She was thinking about the night before, when she had been going through Caleb's quarterly reconciliation and had noticed something in the footnotes. A reference to a land assessment from the county that cited boundary adjustments along the ridge. She had followed the notation out of professional habit, the same way her father had taught her to follow every number to its source, and what she had found had made her set the ledger down and sit very still for a long time, because the county land assessment referenced in Caleb's records had also assessed the Carter property. Her father's property. And the valuation on record did not match what Walter had filed with the land office when he'd refinanced the following year. It was a small difference. A careful person could call it a clerical error. Eliza Carter was a person who understood numbers, and she did not think it was a clerical error. She thought about the locked room. She thought about the papers she had signed in the first year of her marriage, in the warmth of Walter's temporary kindness, in her own grief and vulnerability and inexperience. She thought about the land office, where Walter seemed to have a great deal of business. She sat at the kitchen table across from her husband and looked at him with her clear, trained, steady eyes, and she thought, "I need to know what he's done. And then, underneath that, I need to find out before he realizes I'm looking." The cold, clarifying anger settled into something more focused, something more dangerous, something that felt, finally, a little bit like power. She refilled his coffee cup with a steady hand and smiled the appropriate smile and said, "Would you like the last biscuit?" He said yes. She gave it to him, and she began very quietly to plan. She planned the way her father had taught her to plan, not with emotion, not with urgency, but with the same methodical patience he had applied to every cattle season and every land negotiation and every decision that had consequences past the next morning. First, she needed to see the original deed, not the copy Walter had shown her when she signed the transfer papers. The original, the one her father had filed with the county in 1871 when he'd first secured the 60 acres. The one that would carry James Carter's signature and the original land survey markers and the legal description of every boundary line. She knew where county deed records were kept. She had gone with her father twice as a girl, sitting on the bench outside the county clerk's office while he filed papers, learning from the way he spoke to the clerk, respectfully but precisely, never asking for anything he wasn't entitled to, always knowing exactly which document he needed before he walked through the door. Public records, he'd told her, are called public for a reason. Any person has the right to review them. Remember that, Eliza. Information is not a privilege. It's a right, if you know where to look, she remembered. The county seat was 12 miles from Raven Creek. Walter went to town most Tuesdays on business. She had perhaps 6 hours on a Tuesday when she could take the wagon without accounting for every minute of it. She spent the rest of August being patient. She cooked his meals and kept his house and attended Sunday services and let Dorothy Crane tell her, twice more, about the importance of appearances. And she smiled at all the right moments and said nothing that would cause Walter to watch her more closely than he already was. And on the first Tuesday in September, while Walter was at the bank in Raven Creek with what he said would be a long meeting about the fall cattle contracts, Eliza Carter hitched the wagon herself, told the single remaining ranch hand she was going to the Morrison farm for supplies, and drove 12 miles to the county seat. She found the deed in 40 minutes. The county clerk was a small, careful man named Aldous Reeves, who wore the same expression of mild bureaucratic suspicion for everyone who walked through his door, and he did not ask her why she wanted to see the Carter property deed. Because it was a public record, and public records didn't require explanation. He found it in the files with efficient, practiced hands and laid it on the counter and went back to his desk. She stood at that counter and read her father's land deed for the first time in her life. James Carter's signature was at the bottom, that confident, slightly tilted hand she knew from the ledger margins. The survey markers were precise and specific, describing the 60 acres with the kind of granular detail that meant the boundaries were not subject to interpretation. The deed was clean and clear and exactly what she expected. What she was looking for was something more specific. She found it in the water rights attachment, a supplemental filing her father had added in 1874 when he'd secured the creek access that ran along the northern boundary of the property. The creek access was what made the land genuinely valuable for cattle ranching. Without it, the 60 acres was good, but not exceptional. With it, it was some of the best water-accessible grazing land in that part of Montana. The water rights attachment was filed separately and carried its own legal description, and it was not included in the deed transfer that Walter had filed when Eliza signed the property over to him. She read the transfer document twice, then a third time. The water rights were not there, which meant one of two things. Either Walter had made an error in the original transfer filing, a significant and convenient error that just happened to leave the most valuable legal attachment to the property in a kind of administrative limbo, or Walter had intentionally excluded it. She knew which one it was. She stood very still at the county clerk's counter with both documents in front of her, and felt the cold clarity of the realization move through her from the chest outward, all the way to her hands. He had known about the water rights. He had married her knowing about the water rights. He had maneuvered her into signing the property transfer, knowing that the water rights attachment was filed separately, and that in the chaos of grief and inexperience, she would sign what he put in front of her without knowing what was missing. The property rights had transferred. The water rights had not, which meant, legally, that the Northern Creek access, the access that made the Carter land worth twice what the deed value suggested, was still in her name. Walter had either missed this in his original filing, which she doubted, or he had left it in place deliberately, perhaps planning to have her sign a second document when the time was right, when she was more thoroughly under his control and less likely to ask questions. She had not signed a second document, which meant she was still, legally, the holder of the northern water rights on the Carter property. She stood at that counter for a full minute without moving. Then she asked Aldous Reeves, in the steadiest voice she had ever used, for a certified copy of both documents. He charged her 35 cents, which she paid from the tin behind the flour sack, and he stamped both copies with the county seal and handed them across the counter without looking up from his ledger. She folded them carefully inside her coat. She drove home without stopping, and she unhitched the wagon herself, and she went inside and hid both documents in the place she had prepared, the hollow at the back of the fireplace surround, behind the loose stone she'd discovered 2 winters ago and never mentioned to anyone. And then she made supper, and Walter came home from town with the satisfied look of a man whose bank meeting had gone well. And they ate pot roast, and she asked him polite, appropriate questions about the fall cattle contracts, and he answered them, and she listened. The next morning, she sent a message to Caleb Walker through Morrison's egg delivery. She needed to know something, and she needed to know it from someone she could trust. The message was simple. I need to speak with you. Not about the books. About something I found. E. His response came back in 48 hours. Morrison's farm, Saturday at noon. Tell me when you arrive. Walter played cards with Henderson and Crane on Saturday afternoons. He would be gone by 11 and wouldn't return until past 3. She had 2 hours, maybe slightly more. She arrived at Morrison's at 5 minutes past noon, and Caleb was already there, leaning against the fence near the barn with the ease of a man who had not been pacing, who was simply present and waiting without making a performance of either. She pulled the wagon up and climbed down, and he said, "Ma'am," and she said, "I found something," and he said, "Then let's hear it." They stood near the fence where nobody passing on the road could see them clearly, and she told him, all of it. The county deed, the water rights attachment, the transfer document, the omission that was either an error or a deliberate calculation. She told it quickly and precisely, the way her father had taught her to present information. Facts first, interpretation after, evidence supporting both. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a moment. He had listened to the whole of it without interrupting, and she had noticed, not for the first time, that he was one of the very few people she had encountered in her adult life who listened to a complete thought before responding to it. "How certain are you that it was deliberate?" he asked. "Certain enough that I drove 12 miles to get certified copies before I let myself be certain," she said. He nodded slowly. "The water rights, they're in your name exclusively? Not held jointly?" "Exclusively. The attachment was filed by my father in his name and never transferred. When the property deed transferred to Walter, the attachment stayed in my name by default. If Walter knew that, and I believe he did, he may have been planning to have me sign a separate assignment at some point. But he hasn't. He hasn't." Another silence. She watched him think. The way he did it quietly, without telegraphing the process, just going still while the thinking happened. "You need a lawyer," he said. "I know. Not someone in Raven Creek. I know that too. There's the man in Billings, Thomas Weir. He handled a land dispute for my neighbor 2 seasons ago. Did it right, no theatrics, just clean legal work. He's not afraid of powerful men." He looked at her directly. "He'll want the original certified copies. He'll want to review both documents himself before he tells you where you stand." "How do I contact him without Walter knowing?" Caleb was quiet for a beat. "I can write to him, as if on a business matter. Your situation would be one item in a longer letter. Nothing that looks like what it is, if anyone reads the correspondence before it arrives." He paused. "But Mrs. Hayes, I need you to understand something. Tell me, if you go down this road, if you contact a lawyer and start making formal inquiries into the deed, Walter is going to find out eventually. It won't stay quiet. And when he finds out, he's going to react." She thought about the coffee cup, set down with that precise and threatening care. "I know," she said. "Are you ready for that?" She stood in the September air and thought about the question honestly, the way she had taught herself to think about uncomfortable things, looking directly at them rather than past them, because looking past things had a way of letting them get behind you. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said, "but I know I can't unknow what I found, and I know that if I do nothing, he will find a way to complete the transfer eventually, and then I will have nothing at all. No property, no rights, no legal standing, nothing but what he chooses to give me." She looked at Caleb. "I'd rather face what's coming from a position where I hold something than from one where I hold nothing." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. "I'll write to Weir this week." She drove back to the ranch and had the house exactly as it always was when Walter came home at 3:30, and she served him coffee and listened to his account of the afternoon card game. And she was so present and attentive and normal in every visible way that he had no reason to look more closely. He did not look more closely. He should have. The letter to Thomas Weir went out through Caleb's correspondence that Thursday. The response came back in 11 days. Fast, Caleb said, which meant Weir had taken the case seriously from the initial description. And it was precise and encouraging, and asked for the certified copies to be sent through Caleb's address with a summary of the timeline of events. Eliza wrote the summary at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning while Walter was in town, and she wrote it with the same precision she had brought to the ledgers, laying out dates and facts and documents in clean, logical order. And when she was done, she read it back and thought that her father would have considered it good work. She folded it carefully and sent it with the certified copies through Morrison the following Thursday. And then she waited. Waiting was the hardest thing she had ever done, not because she was afraid, but because she was ready, and being ready with nowhere to direct the readiness was its own kind of torment. She went on with her days, the house, the meals, the Sunday services, the careful navigation of Walter's moods. And underneath all of it, she carried the knowledge of what she had found and what she had set in motion. And it was both lighter and heavier than she'd expected. Lighter because it was real, because it was action rather than endurance, because she was doing something rather than simply surviving something. Heavier because she was doing it alone, in secret, in the spaces between her husband's suspicion and the town's judgment, and the isolation of it sat on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had told herself she was used to being alone. She was beginning to understand there was a difference between being alone with nothing and being alone with something you couldn't share. Thomas Weir's formal assessment arrived 3 weeks later. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, with a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow and the sound of the ranch settling around her in the early quiet. And she read it 3 times because she wanted to understand every word of it before she let herself feel anything about it. Weir was clear. The water rights attachment was legally valid and had not been transferred. Eliza Carter Hayes remained the sole legal holder of the Northern Creek access rights on the property. Furthermore, and this was the part that made her set the letter down for a moment and look at the wall, Weir had pulled the land office filings in Billings and found something additional. Walter had filed a speculative use application on the water rights the previous year. Under Montana territorial law, a speculative use application on water rights not held by the applicant was a legally actionable false claim. It was not a minor clerical issue. It was fraud. She sat with that word for a long time. Fraud. Not carelessness. Not error. Not the comfortable gray area where people like Walter spent their professional lives and called it business. Fraud. She heard the word in her father's voice, from a lesson he had given her when she was 11 years old, sitting at this same table. There are men, Eliza, who build their lives on what other people don't know. The remedy is always the same. You learn what they don't expect you to know, and then you know it. She had learned it. She put Weir's letter in the fireplace hollow with the certified copies. Then something happened that she had not planned for and could not have anticipated. The thing that broke the careful architecture of her patience and forced everything into motion weeks before she was ready. Walter found the ledger. Not Caleb's ranch ledger. She had been scrupulous about returning those through Morrison without a day's delay. He found something else. He found the small notebook. The household accounts book she kept in the kitchen drawer, the one she had been using to track her bookkeeping wages alongside the household expenses. And she had been careful, so careful, to keep those entries in a notation system her father had devised. A shorthand that looked like inventory tallying if you didn't know what you were looking at. Walter did not know what he was looking at. But Walter was not a foolish man, and he was a man who had been watching her more closely for weeks. And he knew enough about the shape of numbers to know that the figures in the November column did not match what she had spent at the market. He came to find her in the kitchen with the notebook in his hand, and his face very controlled in the way that meant the control was costing him something. "What is this?" he said. She looked at the notebook. She thought very quickly. She was not ready. Weir had not yet filed the formal challenge. They needed 2 more weeks at minimum. But ready was no longer an option available to her. "Those are my household accounts," she said. "The November column doesn't match. I track some items separately." "What items?" She looked at him. She thought about 2 years of careful patience and the documents in the fireplace hollow, and Thomas Weir in Billings, and Caleb Walker on the North Ridge, and her father's handwriting in the margins of the ledger, and the 35 cents she had paid to know the truth about her own land. She thought about what her father had said. You learn what they don't expect you to know. And then you know it. She had known it for 6 weeks. Wages, she said. The word landed in the kitchen like something physical. Walter's face went very still. What wage? Bookkeeping wages. I have been managing Caleb Walker's ranch accounts for 3 months, 4 hours a week. I am paid fairly for the work. The silence that followed was unlike any silence she had experienced in this house before. Not the weighted, threatening kind she knew from 100 evenings, but something more charged. Something that had the quality of a moment just before lightning, when the air itself seems to understand what's coming. You have been working, Walter said, for that man. I have been working, she said, with skills my father taught me, for fair wages, in the time I have available while you are in town. After I told you, you told me I couldn't accept charity. She kept her voice level, the way she had practiced for 3 years, but this time the leveling was not submission. It was something more like a foundation. This isn't charity. This is work. I am good at it. I was always good at it. And you have spent 3 years convincing me that what I know doesn't matter, and I have spent 3 months remembering that it does. Walter set the notebook on the table. He placed it down with the same precise, controlled motion as the coffee cup, the gesture that had always preceded the worst conversations. You will end this arrangement, he said. Today. You will send word to Walker that you are done. And then you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about what you think you're entitled to in this marriage. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the fireplace hollow. She thought about Thomas Weir. She thought about the water rights that still carried her name. Walter, she said quietly, before we have that conversation, there's something I think you should know. He waited, jaw set, eyes flat. I have been to the county seat, she said. I have reviewed the deed records, both of them, the original Carter deed and the transfer document you filed. She watched his face. She saw the precise moment he understood what she was saying, the way the controlled expression shifted by a single, involuntary degree. I know about the water rights attachment. I know it was never transferred. And I know about the speculative use application you filed in Billings last year. The kitchen went so quiet, she could hear the fire settle in the stove. I have certified copies, she said, and I have a lawyer in Billings who is currently reviewing the full documentation. Walter did not move. He was very good at not moving. It was one of the things he had always used against her, that absolute physical stillness that made the space around him feel dangerous, that communicated without language, that the capacity for something much worse than stillness was being deliberately held in check. She had been afraid of that stillness for 3 years. She was not afraid of it now. She was not sure exactly when that had changed. She thought it might have been at the county clerk's counter, holding 2 documents that proved her own land still carried her name in ways her husband had not managed to erase. Or it might have been earlier, at the kitchen table with Caleb's ledgers, remembering that she could read numbers and find truths in them. Or maybe it had started the afternoon. Caleb Walker looked at her fence and said, a woman who hasn't been allowed to, and she had not been able to find the angle in it. She stood in her kitchen and looked at her husband and did not look away. You have no idea, Walter said, very quietly, what you are starting. I know exactly what I'm starting, she said. I'm starting with the truth about my father's land. That seems like the right place. He picked up the notebook from the table. He walked past her without another word and went into the back of the house, and she heard the locked room door open and close, and she stood in the kitchen with her hands at her sides and breathed steadily, deliberately, the way you breathe when you have done something irreversible and you need your body to believe you intended it. She had intended it. She was also, she would admit only to herself, in that moment, genuinely afraid, not of Walter specifically, or not only of Walter, but of the size of what she had set in motion, the weight of the machinery she had put into gear, the fact that she had just handed herself from the safety of invisibility into the exposure of being seen, fully seen, by a man who considered her property and had just been told by the property itself that it had other ideas. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then she went to the fireplace and checked the hollow behind the stone. Both documents were there. She left them where they were and went back to the stove and finished making supper, because whatever happened next, the supper still needed making, and she was still the woman making it. And that was not a contradiction she could afford to fall apart over right now. Walter did not come to the table that evening. She ate alone, which she had not done in 3 years, and it was very quiet, and she was surprised to find that the quiet was not the oppressive kind, but the other kind. The kind that belonged entirely to her, that didn't require management or navigation or the careful reading of footsteps. She washed the single dish and the single cup and set them to dry. She went to bed before Walter came out of the back room. She lay in the dark and thought about Thomas Weir in Billings, and the 2 certified copies behind the stone and the cold, clarifying knowledge of what she held and what she intended to do with it. She was still afraid. She was also, for the first time in 3 years, entirely certain she was on the right side of a fight. She closed her eyes and listened to the Montana dark settle around the house her father had built with his careful hands, and his certain knowledge, and his absolute belief that his daughter's mind was worth recording in the margins of his ledgers. Eliza says. She was going to make sure, one way or another, that what Eliza said was heard. Walter did not speak to her for 3 days. That was new. In 3 years of marriage, she had experienced his silences in many forms. The weighted kind, the threatening kind, the kind that was itself a form of punishment. But she had never experienced this particular variety, which was less a silence and more an absence. He moved through the house like a man who had decided she did not exist, who had removed her from his field of vision so completely that passing her in the kitchen required no acknowledgement, no adjustment of course, no recognition that another human being was occupying the same space. She understood what it was. It was a negotiating tactic. It was Walter determining what she would do next by observing what her silence cost her, by measuring her anxiety against his own, by waiting to see who broke first. She let him wait. She cooked his meals and kept his house and slept in the bed beside him in the particular rigid stillness she had developed for bad weeks. And she used the hours he spent in town to do 2 things. The first was to continue Caleb's bookkeeping. She was not stopping, not now, not when the work was the thing keeping her oriented. The second was to begin drafting a full written account of the property situation for Thomas Weir, a detailed timeline that started with her father's original filing and moved through every document she could recall or reconstruct, organized by date, annotated with everything she knew about Walter's business practices and the land office meetings that had seemed, at the time, like ordinary commerce. She wrote it in the mornings at the kitchen table, in the same shorthand her father had taught her, and she hid each completed page in the fireplace hollow with the certified copies, and she felt, with every page, that she was building something, not just a legal case, though it was that, but something more fundamental, a record, an account, a proof that she had been here, that she had known things, that she had acted on what she knew. On the 4th morning, Walter came to breakfast and sat down and said, "I want to discuss this reasonably." She set his coffee in front of him and sat across the table. "All right. You've made some accusations," he said. "I'd like the opportunity to explain them." "They're not accusations. They're documented facts." His jaw tightened, a small movement, quickly controlled. "The water rights situation is a filing oversight. It was an error in the original transfer paperwork. My attorney in Billings missed the attachment. I've been meaning to correct it. You filed a speculative use application on rights you knew were not in your name," she said. "That's not an oversight, Walter. That's a false claim. It was a procedural. It's fraud under territorial law." She said it quietly, without heat. Thomas Weir was very specific. Walter was quiet for a moment. She watched him recalculate, could see the process happening behind his face, the way he reassembled his approach when one angle failed. "Weir," he said. "A Billings lawyer. That was fast work. I've had help. Walker." He said the name like he was biting down on something. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. Confirm it. She didn't need to. "Eliza." His voice changed then. Not threatening, not flat, but something she recognized with cold clarity as a calculated shift toward warmth, toward the register he had used during their courtship, the voice that had worked on her before she understood how deliberately it was deployed. "We built this life together. I know things haven't been easy. I know I've made mistakes. But this, going behind my back to lawyers, threatening legal action against your own husband, this isn't who you are. You don't know who I am," she said. "You spent 3 years making sure I forgot." He set his cup down. She continued before he could reclaim the silence. "I'm not looking for a fight, Walter. I'm looking for what's mine. The water rights are mine. They were my father's, and they came to me, and you did not transfer them legally because I believe you knew they were the most valuable part of the property, and you intended to address that when it suited you. I want them formally acknowledged in my name. I want a complete accounting of the ranch finances for the past 3 years. And I want to be included in every decision made about this property going forward. You want?" He stopped himself. She watched him stop himself with visible effort. "Those are reasonable requests," she said. "A lawyer would tell you they're modest, given what I can document." "And if I refuse?" She looked at him steadily. "Then Thomas Weir files the formal challenge next week, and we let the county court decide." The silence that followed was not the weighted kind or the threatening kind. It was the silence of a man who had just discovered that the door he thought he controlled had a lock on both sides, and the other person had a key. He pushed back his chair and left the table without finishing his breakfast. She sat alone with her coffee and did not allow herself to feel triumphant, because triumph was premature, and she knew it. Walter Hayes did not absorb a blow and surrender. Walter Hayes absorbed a blow and planned his counterstrike, and she had just shown him the exact shape of what she was doing, which meant he now knew what to defend against. She had needed him to know. The alternative, continuing indefinitely in the hidden parallel life, was not sustainable and was not, ultimately, what she wanted. She did not want to spend the rest of her life conducting herself in secret from her own husband. She wanted the secret to become unnecessary because the truth had been established. But she also knew that showing Walter the truth before the truth was fully protected was a risk. She had taken it deliberately. She just needed Weir to move faster than Walter's response. She sent a message to Caleb that afternoon through the Morrison delivery. 3 words. "He knows. Moving faster." Caleb's reply came back in 24 hours. "Weir is ready. Say the word." She said the word on Friday morning. By the following Tuesday, Thomas Weir had filed the formal legal challenge with the county court in the matter of the Carter water rights, citing the original 1874 filing, the incomplete transfer, and the fraudulent speculative use application. The filing was a public record, which meant that within 48 hours, Walter Hayes had a copy in his hands, and so did every other interested party in the county. Raven Creek found out on Thursday. Eliza heard about it from the Morrison farm. Helen Morrison, who was a genuinely kind woman underneath her caution, came to the gate with an expression that was equal parts concern and something that might have been admiration, and told her that talk at the general store had been about nothing else all morning. "They're saying all sorts of things," Helen said carefully. "I expect they are. Some of them—" Helen paused. "Some of them are saying you had no right. That a wife doesn't bring legal action against her husband. That you've disgraced Walter publicly." She hesitated. "But some of them, fewer, but some, are asking why Walter filed that application in Billings." "That's the right question," Eliza said. Helen was quiet for a moment. "Are you safe here, Eliza?" The question was asked with such plain, unornamented worry that it stopped her. Helen Morrison was not a woman who spoke without meaning to. "I don't know," Eliza said honestly. "But I'm safer than I've been in a long time, because I'm not pretending anymore." Helen nodded slowly. She handed over the eggs and a small wrapped package that hadn't been ordered. "I made you cornbread," she said. "Tom will check in on Friday. He'll have reason to ride past." Eliza held the cornbread and thought that kindness, even when it came late and came quietly, and came with conditions attached, was still kindness. "Thank you," she said. Walter came home that evening with the filing document in his hand and his face the color of old stone. He set it on the kitchen table. "Do you understand what this is?" he said. Yes. This is public. This is in the county records. Every person in Montana with access to a courthouse can read this. I know. You have humiliated me. I have filed a legal challenge to protect property that belongs to me. She met his eyes. If that humiliates you, Walter, I'd suggest the humiliation is coming from the thing you did, not from the documentation of it. He crossed the room in 3 steps and she held her ground. Stood exactly where she was, both feet flat, spine straight, because she had decided some time ago, in the kitchen in the September dark, that she would not physically retreat from him again, that she would stand in her own house, and if what came next, she would face it standing rather than braced against a wall. He stopped 2 feet from her. They stood that close for a long, charged moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You think Walker is going to protect you. I'm protecting myself. Walker is going to leave you. Men like that, mountain men, drifters, they don't stay. They help themselves to what they want, and then they're gone, and you'll be left with nothing. No husband, no property, no standing. A divorced woman in this territory is nothing, Eliza. Less than nothing. I'll take my chances." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something that was, she thought, genuinely bewildered. Walter Hayes had lived his entire adult life being the most capable person in any room he entered, the most strategic, the most in control, and he was looking at his wife of 3 years as if she had become someone he didn't recognize, as if the person he had carefully managed had been replaced, while he wasn't looking, with someone he didn't know how to manage. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have." He left the house without eating. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then she went to the fireplace and checked the hollow, and then she sat down and ate her supper alone, and thought about what he'd said about Walker. She thought about it for a long time, not because she was afraid he was right about Caleb. She had stopped measuring Caleb Walker by Walter's standards some time ago, because Walter's standards had been designed to make everyone look diminished by comparison. She thought about it because it touched a thing she had been careful not to examine too closely, a question she had been setting aside on the grounds that it was not the urgent one. But it was real. Caleb Walker had done something rare and something significant. He had seen her clearly, and he had helped her, and he had done it without attaching conditions or expectations to the help, and she would be honest with herself about this in the dark of her own kitchen. She had come to depend on his steadiness in a way that frightened her slightly, because she had no reliable way to know whether what she was feeling was genuine, or whether it was simply the outsized gratitude of a person who had been starved of basic human decency for 3 years, and was mistaking the first decent man she encountered for something more. She didn't know. She also didn't think she needed to know right now. Right now, there was a court filing in Billings and Walter Hayes, somewhere in Raven Creek, calculating his response, and those were the things that required her attention. Walter's response came sooner than she anticipated, and from a direction she hadn't fully prepared for. 3 days after the filing, she received a visit from Reverend Dunmore. She saw him coming up the road from the kitchen window, his distinctive black coat and the precise, upright way. He sat a horse, like a man who considered posture a form of testimony, and she understood immediately why he was here. Walter had sent him, or had arranged for him to come, which amounted to the same thing. Dunmore was the moral authority of Raven Creek, the voice the community used when it wanted to say things that required a certain gravity, and Walter was using him the way he had always used the institutions of the town, as instruments that extended his reach while keeping his hands clean. She met him at the door. "Reverend," she said. "Mrs. Hayes." He removed his hat, which was a gesture of courtesy rather than warmth. "I wonder if I might have a few minutes." She let him in and gave him coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table and let him begin. He talked for 10 minutes. He talked about the sanctity of marriage and the role of a wife in the preservation of the family unit and the damage that public legal disputes cause to community trust. And he talked about forgiveness and the redemptive power of choosing reconciliation over conflict. And he talked about what was owed to a man who had provided a home and stability and security. And he talked about appearances and the long view and the children she might yet have. And he talked, ultimately and circuitously, about what a woman in her position stood to lose if she persisted in this course. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "Reverend Dunmore, did Walter tell you about the water rights?" A pause. He mentioned there was a dispute about the property documentation. Did he mention that he filed a speculative use application on rights he knew were legally in my name? Another pause, shorter. He suggested the documentation situation was more complex than, "Under territorial law, it constitutes fraud," she said pleasantly. "I have a lawyer in Billings who has filed the formal challenge. The county court will review the documentation." She folded her hands on the table. "I have enormous respect for the institution of marriage, Reverend. I also have enormous respect for property law. My father spent 20 years building this land and left it to me. I do not intend to let it be taken from me through paperwork. I didn't understand when I signed it. That is not a spiritual failure. That is a woman protecting what belongs to her." Dunmore looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face. Not agreement exactly, but a recalibration of some kind, a small adjustment. He was, she thought, a man who genuinely believed what he preached, and she did not think he was entirely comfortable being used the way he was being used. Whether that discomfort would translate into anything useful remained to be seen. "I will pray for resolution," he said finally. "I would appreciate that," she said. "Pray specifically for a fair accounting." He left without finishing his coffee. The next move came from a direction she had not anticipated at all. Walter went to Caleb Walker directly. She found out from Helen Morrison, who had found out from her husband, who had been at the livery when Walter rode up to the ridge on a Wednesday morning. Tom had thought nothing of it until Caleb came through town that afternoon with an expression Tom Morrison described, in his careful way, as the kind a man gets when he's been told something he didn't care to hear. Caleb sent a note through the usual channel by Thursday. "Can you come to Morrison's tomorrow?" Noon. She came. Howe was at the fence again. Same place, same easy lean. But his face was different today. There was something underneath the composure that she hadn't seen before, a kind of controlled tension, like a man who was being careful with something fragile. "Walter came to see me," he said. "I heard. He made me an offer." She waited. "He offered to drop all objection to the water rights challenge in exchange for me cutting contact with you entirely. Formally, in writing, delivered to his lawyer." Caleb's voice was even. "He said if I signed a statement saying I had no further professional or personal relationship with you and had no involvement in the legal matter, he would instruct his attorney to let the challenge proceed unchallenged." The air between them was very still. "He thinks you're my leverage," she said. "He thinks I'm yours," Caleb said. "Or that I'm manipulating you. He can't quite decide which version he prefers." He looked at her steadily. He also made it clear that if I declined, he would find other ways to make the situation complicated. He mentioned my grazing permits. He mentioned the county assessor. He mentioned that a man with business interests in this valley has friends in various useful positions. "He's threatening you," she said. "He's trying to." Caleb said it without particular drama. "He's a man who solves problems by making them someone else's problem. I've met the type." Caleb. She used his name deliberately. She had used it so rarely, had kept a careful formal distance on it in deference to the situation. And the deliberateness of it landed between them with its own small weight. If he follows through on those threats, the permits, the assessor, that could cause you real damage. "Yes," he said, "you don't have to stay in this." He looked at her for a long moment. "Eliza," he said, and the use of her given name was its own kind of answer, quiet and certain, and without the quality of performance. "I made my choice when I told you about the water rights discrepancy in the records. I didn't do that by accident. I did it because I'd already decided that what was happening to you was wrong, and I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't seen it." She felt something shift in her chest. "He could hurt your ranch," she said. "He could try." He turned and looked at the fence he had fixed, the fence her father had built, the fence where all of this had begun. "But here's what I've figured out about men like Walter Hayes. They count on the people around them being afraid of the cost of standing up. They count on isolation. They count on everyone deciding that the right thing isn't worth the risk. He looked back at her. I'm not afraid of the cost, and I'm not leaving you to stand in this alone. She stood with those words. She had told herself, multiple times and in various ways, that she didn't need anyone to stand beside her. She had told herself that the whole point of what she was doing was to demonstrate that she could stand on her own. Both of those things were true. She had meant them when she said them. But there was something specific and real about hearing a man say he was choosing to be present, not because he had been obligated or manipulated or strategically positioned to do so, but because he looked at an unjust situation and decided that witnessing it without acting made him complicit in it, and he wasn't willing to be complicit in it. He'll call you a liar, she said. When you go to town, he'll have already started. Probably, Caleb said. What's he going to say? That you manipulated me, that you used my situation to get access to the property, that the whole thing, the bookkeeping, the fence repairs, the legal help, was calculated to get your hands on the water rights. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, is there anyone in that town who's watched Walter Hayes operate for long enough to know that story is more characteristic of him than of me? She thought about it. Henderson at the feed store, she said slowly. He's had dealings with Walter that haven't always gone the way Walter described them afterward. And Judge Albright. He's reviewed land filings in this county for 15 years. He'll know the speculative use application was not a clerical error. Then those are the conversations that matter, Caleb said. Let Walter tell his story. Truth has a way of outlasting a convenient narrative, especially when there are documents involved. She thought about her father's ledgers. She thought about Aldous Reeves at the county clerk's office, stamping the certified copies without asking why. She thought about Thomas Weir, precise and unhurried, building the legal case one documented fact at a time. Documents, she thought. Documents and patience, and the willingness to keep standing. I turned down his offer, Caleb said, in case that wasn't clear. It was clear, she said. Thank you. He nodded once, a small, certain thing. She drove back to the ranch and found Walter in the back room, the locked room, which he'd been spending increasing amounts of time in since the filing. She didn't knock. She had decided some time ago that she was done knocking on doors inside her father's house. She knocked anyway. A pause. What? I want to talk, she said. I have nothing to say to you. I have things to say to you. She heard the silence recalibrate on the other side of the door. You went to Caleb Walker and tried to bribe him into abandoning me. You threatened his grazing permits. You are doing to him what you've done to everyone who has ever inconvenienced you. You're using your position and your connections to make the cost of opposing you too high. She kept her voice level. It won't work this time. A longer silence. Then the door opened. Walter stood in the doorframe of the room that held her father's books and looked at her with something she hadn't expected. Exhaustion. Not the strategic exhaustion of a man performing vulnerability, but the genuine article, the look of a person who has been spending energy at a rate they can't sustain and is beginning to feel the deficit. You want to destroy me, he said. I want what's mine, she said. That's not the same thing. The town will choose sides. They already have. They'll choose mine. Some of them, she agreed. Some of them will always choose the man with the most power, because that's the safe bet and they know it. But some of them are already asking the right questions, Walter. And the county court doesn't care about sides. It cares about documentation. He leaned against the doorframe. She had never seen him lean before. He was not a man who leaned, who showed fatigue in his posture. The lean was real, and it told her something important. What do you actually want? He asked. Not legally, not theoretically. What do you want out of this marriage, Eliza? Because I'm trying to understand what you think happens after all this. It was, she thought, perhaps the most honest question he had ever asked her, and it deserved an honest answer. I want the water rights formally acknowledged in my name, she said. I want a complete financial accounting of the past 3 years, every transaction, every filing, every decision made about this property. I want to be a legal partner in the management of this ranch, with my name on the relevant documents. And I want your word, not just your word, but a legally binding agreement, that the financial decisions of this ranch will be made jointly." He stared at her. "You want to run the ranch. I want to help run the ranch, the way I always should have been doing, the way my father taught me to." She kept her eyes on his. "I'm good at it, Walter. You knew I was good at it. That's part of why you married me. You wanted the land, and you wanted the skills that came with it, and then you decided you could have the land without acknowledging the skills. You were wrong." He looked at her for a very long time. She thought she saw something move across his face, something complex, something she couldn't fully read, something that might have been the beginning of an acknowledgement and might have been the beginning of something else entirely. Then he said, "I need time." "Thomas Weir's court date is in 3 weeks," she said. "You have until then." She turned and walked back to the kitchen. She had been holding her breath without knowing it, and she let it out slowly against the kitchen wall, one hand pressed flat against the wood. Her father had planned smooth, and she stood there for a moment and felt the house settle around her. The next 2 weeks were unlike anything in her experience. They lived in the same house as people who were negotiating the terms of their own lives, politely, carefully, at a managed distance that had its own strange quality, less hostile than before, but more charged, because now both of them understood what was actually at stake, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. Walter made calls in Billings. She knew this because Helen Morrison mentioned that the telegraph office had logged 2 messages to a Billings law firm. Not Weir's firm, a different one with the kind of name that meant old money and political connections. Walter was not surrendering. He was preparing a counter-strategy. She expected it. She had expected it from the beginning. What she hadn't expected was what happened at church on the 3rd Sunday of October. She had almost not gone. She had been attending services throughout the legal process with a composure she mostly felt and partly performed, ignoring the looks and the whispers and the careful way certain women rearranged themselves to avoid being seen in close conversation with her, because she had decided that the best response to social judgment was continued presence rather than retreat. She went. Caleb Walker was there. I wasn't usually at the Raven Creek Church. He attended services at the Ridge Community Chapel, a smaller congregation that held service on alternating Sundays. She saw him in the 3rd pew and understood immediately that his presence was intentional and deliberate, that he had come to the Raven Creek service specifically on this Sunday. She understood why when the service ended and they filed out into the cold October morning, and Walter, who had been positioned near the front steps to receive the community's visible support, turned and saw Caleb Walker standing calmly in the churchyard. The whole congregation seemed to register the moment simultaneously. The slight collective intake, the adjustment of attention toward the 2 men, the particular quality of silence that falls when everyone present knows something significant is about to happen, and nobody wants to be the one who causes it. Walter walked toward Caleb. Caleb didn't move. "Walker," Walter said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the edge underneath it. "Hayes." Caleb's voice was even. "You have some nerve showing up here." "I attend church when I'm able. This morning I was able." "After everything you've done, I'd like you to tell me specifically what I've done," Caleb said. Not loudly, conversationally, in the way of a man who was genuinely inviting the answer rather than making a speech. "Because from where I stand, I repaired a fence and hired a skilled bookkeeper and suggested she speak with a lawyer when she found documentation that warranted legal review. I'd like to hear which of those things you consider wrong." The churchyard was very quiet. Eliza stood near the church steps and did not move and did not look away. "She is my wife," Walter said through his teeth. "Yes," Caleb said, "and the water rights are hers. Both of those things can be true." A sound moved through the assembled congregation. Not a murmur exactly, more like the collective sound of people realizing something, a small communal recognition. She watched Henderson at the feed store look at his boots, and then at Walter, and then at Caleb. She watched Judge Albright, who had come to Sunday service in Raven Creek for the first time in several months, stand very still with his hands clasped behind his back, and an expression of precise professional neutrality. Walter turned and looked at her. She looked back at him. "You did this," he said. "I didn't plan this," she said. "But I'm not sorry it happened." He turned and walked to his horse without another word to anyone, and the congregation parted for him, and he rode away. And Eliza stood in the cold October morning in the churchyard of the town she had lived in her whole life, and breathed the clean air, and felt something she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment to identify it. It was the feeling of being seen, not by Caleb, though he was looking at her with that steady, clear-eyed way of his. By all of them. By Henderson and Judge Albright and Dorothy Crane, and even Margaret Tilley, and all the others who had watched and whispered and looked away. They were looking at her now, fully, with the recalibrated attention of people who had been presented with information that changed the context of everything they thought they'd known. And some of those looks were still critical, and some of them were carefully neutral, and a few of them, carried something that looked like it might become respect if she gave it time. Caleb came to stand beside her. Not in front of her. Beside her. "You all right?" he asked, quietly enough for only her to hear. "Yes," she said. And she was. She was more all right than she had been in 3 years, standing in the churchyard of Raven Creek, with the October cold in her lungs, and the legal challenge in process, and her father's water rights in her name, and a man beside her who had chosen to be there because he believed it was right. "He's going to fight the case," she said. "Hi is. It's going to take time. Most things worth having do." She looked at him sidelong. Hi was looking at the road Walter had ridden down, his expression thoughtful. "Why did you come today?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you've been standing alone in rooms and in this town for 3 months, he said. "And I thought it was time for someone to stand beside you where everyone could see it." She thought about that. She thought about all the ways that gesture could be read, and all the ways she wanted to read it, and all the ways she was still not certain she could trust herself to read anything correctly, given how thoroughly 3 years had eroded her instincts about people and intentions. Then she thought about the fence, and the ledgers, and the Morrison eggs, and the note burned over the stove, and every conversation they had conducted across kitchen tables and fence lines in the long discipline of treating each other like people who had rights and intelligence and agency. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to thank me for that." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." They stood in the October churchyard of Raven Creek for another few minutes, not speaking, while the congregation dispersed around them, and Eliza Carter Hayes stood on the ground. Her father had walked and felt the weight of 3 years beginning, slowly and incrementally, and not without effort, to shift. Walter's counterfiling arrived from the Billings firm 12 days later. She read it at the kitchen table with Weir's initial assessment open beside it, comparing the arguments, following the legal logic, and she felt her stomach tighten. Not from fear, but from the recognition that Walter had hired people who were genuinely good at what they did. The counterfiling challenged the 1874 water rights attachment on the grounds of procedural irregularity in the original filing, a technical argument, but one that would need to be answered carefully. She sent it to Weir with a 3-page annotation of the specific points she considered most vulnerable. Weir wrote back in 8 days with a response that began, "Mrs. Hayes, your annotation is the most useful client communication I have received in 11 years of practice." She held that letter longer than she held any of the others. She did not burn it. She put it in the fireplace hollow with the certified copies and Weir's formal assessment and her own annotated timeline. And she put it there knowing that the hollow was becoming a kind of archive, a record, a proof, a collection of evidence that something real and consequential had happened here, that a woman in a kitchen in Montana had done the patient, difficult, unglamorous work of knowing what she had and fighting for it with the only weapons she could access, precision and documents, and the willingness to keep standing even when the standing was very, very hard. The court date was in 11 days. She was ready. Or not ready exactly. She had given up expecting to feel ready, because readiness, she had discovered, was less a state you arrived at and more a decision you kept making, one morning at a time. She made it again the following morning. and the morning after that. And on the morning of the 8th day before the court date, she woke up before dawn and lay in the dark beside the man she had married and listened to the house and felt, running underneath everything, the particular quality of a life about to change. Not in the dramatic, sudden way, not like a storm breaking, but in the slow and certain way of a season turning, of something that has been changing for a long time, finally becoming visible. She got up. She made coffee. She sat at her father's table in her father's house on her father's land, and she waited for the light. The morning of the court date came in the way of all significant mornings. Unremarkably, without ceremony, with the same gray November light and the same cold settling through the walls and the same sound of the ranch waking up around her that she had lived inside for 3 years. Eliza was already dressed when Walter came downstairs. She had been up since 4. She had sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and gone through every document one final time. Not because she needed to, not because she had missed anything, but because the act of reading them grounded her in the facts, and the facts were what she needed to carry into that courtroom. Not emotion, not history, not 3 years of accumulated damage. The facts, clean and documented and stamped with the county seal, and annotated by a woman who had learned from her father that truth was only as powerful as the evidence you built around it. Walter came into the kitchen and looked at her, at the dress she had chosen carefully, dark wool, the one she wore to serious occasions. And something crossed his face that she couldn't entirely read. "You're going," he said. "Yes." "To sit in that courtroom and watch." "Thomas Weir asked me to be present, as the petitioner." She set down her coffee cup. "I intend to be." He poured himself coffee and stood at the stove with his back to her for a moment. When he turned around, his expression had settled into something she recognized as the professional face, the one he wore to the land office, to the bank, to every room where he needed to be perceived as the reasonable man. "It doesn't have to go this way," he said. "You had 3 weeks," she said. "You chose to file a counter-challenge. I chose to defend myself against the truth." She said it without anger, which was important. Anger would have made it about feeling. She wanted it to be about fact. "Walter, I've given you every opportunity to resolve this without a court proceeding. You had the option of acknowledging the water rights and providing a financial accounting and letting this be a private matter between a husband and wife sorting out a property error. You chose the Billings firm instead. Because you backed me into a corner. I showed you a document," she said. "What you did in response was your choice." He looked at her for a long moment. "If we lose today," he started. "I'm not going to lose," she said. It came out simply, without bravado, because it wasn't bravado. It was the same flat recognition of documented fact that she had been living inside for 3 months. She had the original deed. She had the water rights attachment. She had the certified copies. She had Weir's meticulous legal preparation and her own 3-page annotation, and 11 years of Thomas Weir's practiced credibility in front of every judge in the county. Walter had a technical argument about procedural irregularity in a 30-year-old filing and a Billings firm that charged by the hour. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. "I'll be back this afternoon," she said. She drove herself to the county seat. Thomas Weir was already in the courthouse lobby when she arrived. A compact, deliberate man in his 50s, with the specific calm of someone who had been in courtrooms long enough to have stopped finding them intimidating. He shook her hand with the same brisk efficiency he brought to everything, and looked at her face and said, "How are you holding up?" "Steadily," she said. "Good." He opened his case and removed the file. "Cranston, that's Walter's man from Billings, is going to lead with the procedural argument on the 1874 filing. He'll say the attachment was improperly executed and therefore legally separable from the original deed in a way that rendered it void at the point of the property transfer." He said it quickly, laying out the opposition's strategy the way a doctor describes a diagnosis, clearly, without flinching. "I'll answer that with the county recording records, which show the attachment was accepted and indexed by the county clerk's office, which constitutes legal acknowledgement regardless of any procedural questions about the original execution. I'll also present the speculative use application, which demonstrates that Walter Hayes treated the water rights as a distinct and legally significant asset separate from the deed, which directly undermines the argument that they were simply absorbed in the transfer. He argued for their separateness when it suited him, she said. Exactly. Weir's expression was as close to satisfied as she had seen it. And I'm going to let him make that argument for me. She sat in the courtroom for 4 hours. It was nothing like what she had imagined from the outside. It was precise and procedural and moved more slowly than she expected. Full of legal language, she had to parse carefully and long stretches of document review and the back and forth of 2 practiced attorneys doing careful, unglamorous work. Cranston was good. She could see why Walter had hired him. The way he moved through the procedural argument with smooth professional confidence, building the case that the 1874 attachment was technically deficient and therefore legally unenforceable as a standalone claim. But Weir was better, and Weir had the speculative use application. When he introduced it into the record, the application Walter had filed in Billings the previous year, claiming rights he knew were not in his name. She watched Judge Albright's expression change. It was a small change, the kind a trained observer would catch and a casual observer would miss, a slight tightening around the eyes that meant a man who had been listening carefully had just heard the thing that answered the question he had been holding. Cranston objected. Twice. Both objections were overruled. Walter sat at the table beside his attorney with his hands flat and still, and Eliza sat in the gallery and watched him and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of deep, quiet relief. The sensation of a weight that has been held at great cost for a very long time, finally being set down. Judge Albright did not rule immediately. He reviewed the documents for 30 minutes in chambers, while the attorneys waited, and Eliza sat in the gallery and breathed steadily and thought about her father sitting at his kitchen table with the original deed in his hands, signing it with that confident, slightly tilted hand. When Albright came back, his expression told her nothing, which she had learned to interpret as a good sign. A judge who was about to rule against you gave subtle advance signals, the small preparation of a person getting ready to deliver unwelcome news. He ruled in her favor. The water rights attachment was legally valid. The county recording records constituted sufficient acknowledgement of the filing. The speculative use application demonstrated Walter Hayes's own acknowledgement of the rights as a distinct legal asset. The petitioner's claim was sustained. The water rights on the northern boundary of the Carter property remained in the name of Eliza Carter Hayes, and any further claim or application made on those rights by Walter Hayes without the petitioner's legal consent was enjoined. He also referred the speculative use application to the county attorney's office for review of potential fraudulent filing. That last part was not something Weir had asked for. Albright had added it himself. She sat in the gallery and heard the words and felt them settle into her body one at a time, felt them become real in the way that only spoken public words become real, different from the private knowing she had carried for 3 months, different from the documents in the fireplace hollow. This was the truth being said out loud, in a room, by a person with the authority to say it. Walter did not look at her. He spoke briefly with Cranston in a low voice, and then he walked out of the courtroom, and she watched him go with the same clear, direct gaze she had been training herself to maintain, and she did not feel anything she would call happiness exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than happiness. It was something that had to do with her father's name on a deed, and a county clerk stamping certified copies, and a woman who had spent 3 years being told she had nothing. Making the careful, methodical, unglamorous discovery that she had something after all. Weir shook her hand outside the courthouse. "That's about as clean a ruling as I've seen," he said. "Albright is good." "He added the referral himself," she said. "He did." Weir's expression was carefully neutral in the way of a man who had opinions he was choosing not to voice in a courthouse. "I'd expect the county attorney's office to be in contact with you in the coming weeks. You'll want to preserve all your documentation." "It's preserved," she said. He nodded. "I know." He picked up his case. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Hayes, your annotations were correct on every point, every single one." She drove home. The drive was 12 miles of November cold and empty road, and the sound of the horses' hooves on the packed dirt. And she sat in the wagon and let the result move through her slowly, the way important things need time to become fully real. She thought about what came next. The court ruling was not an ending. She understood that clearly. Walter still lived in the house. The ranch was still jointly managed in the absent sense that both their names were still associated with it. The county attorney's referral meant there would be further proceedings, further documentation, further standing in rooms and presenting facts and waiting for people with authority to review what she had brought them. The legal process, Weir had told her at their first meeting, was not a single event. It was a series of events, and the patience required to move through them was not unlike the patience required to manage a ranch. Seasonal, methodical, composed of small daily decisions that accumulated over time into something larger. She was prepared for that. What she was less prepared for, she discovered when she got home, was what she found waiting at the gate. Caleb Walker's horse was tied to the fence post. He was standing near the south fence, the fence he had fixed, the fence where everything had begun, with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, which was the only gesture she had ever seen from him that communicated something other than composure. She pulled the wagon up and climbed down. "You heard," she said. "Morrison's boy came up the ridge an hour ago." He looked at her. "Albright ruled for you." He did. He nodded once, and she saw the relief in it. Real relief, not the performed kind, the kind that moves through a person's body before they can decide how to present it. "The referral, too," she said. His expression shifted. He referred the application to the county attorney. On his own. Weir didn't ask for it. Caleb was quiet for a moment, turning his hat. Then he said, "Your father would have been proud of you today." She had been holding herself very carefully since the courtroom, since the ruling, since the drive home, holding the emotion at a distance, the way you hold a lamp at arm's length to see by it without burning yourself. She had been managing it, as she managed most things, with the precise and practiced discipline of a woman who had learned that composure was survival. She felt it slip, just slightly, at those words. Not dramatically. She didn't weep. She had done her weeping in private, in the small hours, in the way of women who had learned to do difficult things without an audience. But something in her face moved, some small muscle that she couldn't entirely control, and she looked at the fence rather than at Caleb for a moment until she was certain of herself again. "Yes," she said. "I think he would have." A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, not charged in the way their silences sometimes were, but the kind that happens between people who have been through something together and are resting briefly in the aftermath. "What happens now?" Caleb asked. "The county attorney's office will want statements. Weir says there will likely be further proceedings on the fraud referral. Walter's attorneys will file motions." She pressed her lips together. "It's not over." "No," he said, "but the most important thing is decided." "Yes." She turned and looked at the house, her father's house, the house that held the hollow in the fireplace surround, and the locked room, and 3 years of her own silent history. "I need to go inside and think." "Of course." He put his hat back on. "Caleb." He stopped. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer me honestly." "I'll try," he said. "Why did you come back? After the fence? You could have finished the post and ridden back up the ridge and never thought about this property again." She watched his face. "You're not a man who fixes fences he's not responsible for out of idle curiosity. You came back. And then you kept coming back. And I need to understand why." He held her gaze for a moment. The November cold moved around them. "I came back the first time because the north corner post needed work, and I'd told you it did," he said. "That's the honest answer to the first time." He paused. "I came back after that because I'd seen enough of the world to recognize what I was looking at. And what I was looking at was a woman with a good mind and a capable pair of hands and no room to use either. And that bothered me the way a crooked fence bothers me. Not because it's my fence, because it's wrong, and a thing that's wrong that you have the ability to fix doesn't stop bothering you just because it isn't yours." She was quiet. And then I kept coming back, he said. Because somewhere in the middle of the ledgers and the Morrison eggs and the letters through the fence slats, I stopped being bothered by the injustice and started being interested in the woman. He said it without elaboration, without the kind of ornamentation that would have made it smaller. Just clean and direct, the way he said most things. She stood with that for a moment. I don't know what I am yet, she said. After all this. I don't know who I am on the other side of this, and I think I need to find out before I know what I'm able to offer anyone. That's fair, he said. It might take time. I've got time, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him. She thought about the fence and the ledgers, and the letter burned over the stove, and the note she had sent through the egg delivery, and the Saturday at Morrison's farm, and the churchyard in October, and every small, specific, concrete thing he had done over the course of 7 months that added up to something she didn't yet have a complete word for. She thought about what it meant that he was still here. All right, she said quietly. He nodded once and untied his horse and rode back up the ridge, and she watched him go, and then turned and walked into her father's house. Walter came home that evening. She was at the kitchen table with Weir's case notes when she heard the door, and she set down her pen and waited. He came in and looked at her and looked at the table and set his hat on the hook and sat down in his chair. Not across from her with the antagonism of the last weeks. Just in the chair, the way a person sits when they have run out of places to stand. Cranston says we can appeal, he said. You can, she said. That's your right. He says the grounds are limited. They are. Silence. The county attorney, he said. Yes. He rubbed his face with one hand, a gesture she had almost never seen from him, too unguarded, too much like fatigue being admitted. I didn't think it would go this far, he said. She looked at him. What did you think would happen? I thought you'd stop. He said it without particular drama, without the flatness he used as a weapon. He said it like a fact he was reporting about himself, something observed from a distance. I thought at some point you'd stop, that the cost would be too high, or you'd be too afraid, or you'd... He stopped, started again. I've known you for 4 years, and I didn't know you would do this. I know, she said. That's my failure, he said, not knowing what you were capable of. He said it without generosity, without the warmth that might have made it a compliment. He said it the way a man speaks a fact he has finally conceded. Yes, she said. It is. He was quiet for a long time. I'm not going to appeal, he said finally. She was careful not to react too quickly. Cranston will tell you the grounds are limited, but not non-existent, she said. I know what Cranston will tell me. His voice was tired. I'm telling you what I've decided. He looked at her across the table, looked at her, fully, in the way he hadn't in months, maybe longer. I want a complete accounting. I'll have my books reviewed by an independent auditor. Whatever is owed to you, from the ranch operations, from the property, I'll make it right. She said nothing. And the water rights, he said. I'll sign whatever Weir needs. She kept her face still. What do you want in return? I want this to be over, he said. I want the county attorney business to resolve without... He stopped. I want to salvage what I can salvage. She thought about it honestly. She had not come into this wanting to destroy Walter Hayes. She had said that, and she had meant it. She had come into it wanting what was hers, and what was hers was now legally established. And the question of what happened to the man who had taken it was a separate question from whether she could protect herself. I'll speak with Weir, she said. I can't make you promises about the county attorney. That's not in my hands. But I will tell him you cooperated voluntarily with the accounting and the deed correction. That will mean something. He nodded. They sat in the kitchen in the November dark, and outside the wind moved against the house with a sound like the territory itself reminding them where they were. Montana, 1886, the tail end of a world that was already changing, already becoming something its original inhabitants hadn't planned for, already making room for things that hadn't been there before. Walter Hayes moved out of the house 3 weeks later. He didn't leave the valley. He moved to rooms above the land office in Raven Creek, which was both practical and symbolic. The kind of choice that said everything about what a person valued. He and his Billings attorneys completed the financial audit through December, and the numbers that came out of it were what she had expected from her 3 years of careful observation. Not catastrophic, but not clean either. A record of decisions made without consultation and resources directed without accounting that, had they been managed differently, would have left the property in considerably better shape than it currently stood. Weir presented the audit results to the county attorney. The speculative use application resulted in a formal censure and a fine, not imprisonment, which she had not sought, but a public legal record that said what it said and could not be unmade. The financial settlement was finalized in January. The water rights were formally corrected in the county records. Eliza Carter Hayes, sole holder. The ranch operations were restructured with Eliza named as legal co-manager, with oversight authority over the financial accounts and the right to engage in cattle transactions independently. She sat in Weir's office in Billings on the day of the final signing and read every document before she signed it, the way her father had always told her to. And Weir watched her read with the expression of a man who had finally met a client who did things correctly. "You know," he said, when she reached the last page, "most people in your position would have settled for the water rights and called it done." "I know," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about the question. "Because the water rights were mine, and that was the beginning. But the way the ranch was managed was also something I had been excluded from, and that exclusion had cost me, and the property, significantly." She signed the last page. "My father built this land to last. I intend to manage it that way." Weir took the signed documents and shook her hand. "I believe you will," he said. She drove back to Raven Creek in the January cold and arrived at the ranch as the afternoon light was going gray, and she unhitched the wagon and checked the south fence. Still solid. Still the fence Caleb had rebuilt in June. The fence that had started all of this. And she stood at the fence post for a moment in the cold and breathed. Caleb came by the following Saturday. Not through Morrison's this time. She had told him, the previous week, that he didn't need to come through the eggs anymore. He could come to the gate. He came to the gate. They walked the property line in the January cold, the two of them, because she wanted to walk it and she wanted company for the walking. She showed him the north corner post he had replaced. Still solid, still true, not healed at all. She showed him the creek access along the northern boundary, the water rights that now carried her name in the public record. She showed him the places where the land would need attention in the spring. The drainage along the east fence, the condition of the hay pasture, the supply situation that would need renegotiation before the summer grazing season. He listened to all of it the way he always listened, with full attention and without performing the attention, without making a production of taking her seriously, because he simply did. "You're going to need help in the spring," he said, at the east fence. "The drainage work alone is a 2-person job, minimum." "I know," she said. "I'm going to hire on. I could send my man Briggs. He's good with drainage, and he's not afraid of a woman with opinions about how things should be done." She looked at him sideways. "You've worked with women who have opinions about how things should be done?" "Just the one," he said. "So far." She felt something move through her that was related to, but not identical to amusement. Something warmer than that, something with more future in it. "I have a proposition," she said. "I'm listening. Your books are in good shape now. I've been managing them for 7 months, and you know exactly where you stand. But your winter feed contract needs renegotiating before February. The Billings supplier is still overcharging you on lot pricing, and I've identified a supplier out of Helena who would save you approximately $80 a season on equivalent quality." She stopped at the corner post and turned to face him. "I would like to formalize the bookkeeping arrangement, not as an informal exchange through egg deliveries, as a proper contracted service. My name on the agreement, a stated wage, a clear scope of work." He looked at her. "And the drainage work in the spring," she continued. "If Briggs is available, I'd like to bring him on as a contracted hand for the East Fence project, with me managing the work schedule and the supply coordination." "You want to run a work project," he said. "I want to use my skills," she said. The ones my father taught me. The ones I used to have a whole ranch's worth of room to use. She held his gaze. I've got that room back now. I intend to use it. He looked at her for a long moment with the dark, steady eyes that had registered her accurately from the first day at the south fence, that had seen the person underneath the performance of survival before she had been able to see it herself. All right, he said. All right? The bookkeeping contract, the Helena supplier, Briggs for the drainage in March. He said it simply. And whatever else you decide needs doing. She turned and looked out at the water rights land, the northern boundary where the creek moved under the January ice, and the cattle would come back to drink in the spring as they always had, as they had since her father first ran water lines through this valley with careful hands and the specific kind of faith that looks like practicality. One more thing, she said. He waited. I told you in November that I didn't know who I was yet, she said. On the other side of all this. She felt the cold in her lungs, and the ground solid under her feet, and the fence line extending in both directions, the property that carried her name in the county records. I think I'm beginning to know. He said nothing. He just listened, which was what he did. I'm James Carter's daughter, she said. I'm a woman who understands numbers and land and what it takes to make a ranch survive a Montana winter. I'm a woman who drove 12 miles to find the truth about her own property and built a legal case document by document and stood in a courtroom and watched justice land where it belonged. She turned and looked at him. And I'm a woman who is going to need, for a while yet, to be those things first and foremost, before anything else. I know, he said. But not only those things, she said. Not forever only those things. The air between them had a quality she had stopped trying to manage or measure or hold at arm's length. It was real. It had been real for some time. She was simply finally in a position to stand in it without the ground feeling uncertain beneath her feet. I can wait, he said. I know you can, she said. That's one of the things I know about you. He touched the brim of his hat in that particular way. The gesture she had catalogued from the very first afternoon. The one that meant respect without transaction, acknowledgement without demand. And they walked back along the fence line in the January cold, the two of them, past the south fence and the gate and the house her father had built on good land with good bones. And Eliza Carter Hayes walked on her own ground and breathed her own air and felt, for the first time in longer than she could honestly name, that the life she was living was entirely and completely hers. The spring came early that year. The drainage work along the east fence was finished in March, on schedule, under budget, managed by a woman who knew what she was doing and refused to pretend otherwise. The Helena supplier contract was signed in February and saved Caleb Walker $83 in the first season alone. The bookkeeping arrangement was formalized in writing, her name on the document, fair wage, clear scope, exactly as she had proposed at the fence post in January. Raven Creek watched all of it. Some of them watched with their arms crossed. Some of them watched with the careful, adjusting attention of people revising a previous assessment. Henderson at the feed store started referring customers to her when they had questions about supply pricing and land valuations. Judge Albright nodded to her on the street without the weighted caution of a man worried about what acknowledging her might cost him. Dorothy Crane stopped her after church one Sunday in April. Eliza braced for it, for the same careful, wrapped in concern judgment she had been receiving from Dorothy for years. Instead, Dorothy said quietly, I want you to know I was wrong about what I said last fall. She did not elaborate. She did not have to. I was wrong. Eliza looked at her. Thank you for saying so, she said. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was the beginning of the long, ordinary work of living in a community that had failed you and choosing, day by day, what that failure meant for how you moved forward. It was not dramatic. It was not simple. It was what it was. Real, imperfect, and worth doing. She was good at doing things that were worth doing. Caleb Walker came for supper on a Thursday evening in May, the first time he had come to the house for a reason other than business. She cooked the way her mother had taught her, the way she had not cooked for anyone in years, with care and without obligation, because she wanted to. They ate at her father's table and talked about the spring cattle market and the drainage project and a dispute about grazing permits on the North Ridge that needed navigating. And the conversation moved the way conversations move between people who have learned to respect each other's intelligence and enjoy each other's company. After supper, she made coffee, and they sat on the porch in the May evening. Not touching, not performing anything. Just two people in the last light of a spring day in Montana. And she thought about the south fence, and the certified copies, and the kitchen table at 4 in the morning, and the long, patient, difficult journey from a woman pressing her back against a cold wall to a woman sitting on her own porch in the last light of May. She thought about her father. She thought about what he would have said if he could have seen this day. She thought he probably would have said exactly what Caleb Walker had said at the fence that first afternoon. The thing that had started all of it. The sentence she had carried through every hard week and every court document and every morning when she'd had to decide again to keep standing. Good bones. She had good bones. This land had good bones. Her father had known it. Caleb had known it. And she had spent 3 years forgetting it, and 7 months remembering, and the rest of her life ahead of her to build on what she remembered. The last light moved across the valley. She was still here. She had always been here. This was Eliza Carter's land, and Eliza Carter's life, and Eliza Carter's name in the county records where it belonged. And the woman who lived it had been forged not by rescue, not by the arrival of someone stronger to carry her burden, but by the slow and certain fire of a person who looked at what had been taken from her and decided, with both hands and a clear mind and the full weight of everything her father had taught her, to take it back. She picked up her coffee cup. She looked at the last light. She was not waiting for